Have you heard of something called ACEs? Adverse childhood experiences. These are negative things that happen to us as kids, and they can have a profound effect on the rest of our lives. So understanding what ACEs are, where they come from, how many you might have, and how they affect you is absolutely vital if you want to free yourself from the past. I'm Nicola, and for the last 25 years I've been exploring ways to release my patterns of pain so I don't repeat the cycle and pass my stuff on to my kids, and I would love to help you do the same. So what exactly are ACEs? Well, an ACE is an adverse childhood experience. These are stressful or harmful things that happen to us as kids, and generally they negatively impact our sense of safety, stability and well-being. And there was a research study done in the 1990s called The Relationship of Childhood Abuse and Household Dysfunction to Leading Causes of Death in Adults. And there's been many more studies done on this since, but this one was groundbreaking in what it showed about the impact of these experiences. They looked at 17,000 mostly middle class, well-educated adults from the US, and they looked at these events in their childhood and then looked at particular outcomes that they were experiencing as adults. And what they looked at for the childhood ACEs was toxic stress, so chronic experiences, chronic exposure to stressful experiences that were negative, and they grouped them into three main categories. So the first category is abuse. This is direct negative impact on the child. So this might be things like physical abuse, violence, this might be emotional abuse, this could be shaming, name-calling, criticism, or it could be sexual abuse. The second category was neglect. So this is direct absence of positive inputs for these kids. So physical neglect, maybe not having enough to eat, no clean clothes to wear, nowhere safe to sleep, not feeling safe in the environment, or it could be emotional neglect, not feeling connected, loved, supported, valued, appreciated in that environment. And then the third category was more indirect effects of the environment, so dysfunctional households, things like parents struggling with substance abuse or having mental health issues, maybe witnessing domestic violence between parents, maybe having a parent in jail, or being part of divorce or separation. And more recently, we've expanded that to include things like living in unsafe neighbourhoods, experiencing bullying, or experiencing the death of a loved one. And so these are all these negative chronic stress, these toxic stress that can negatively impact a child. And they then looked at the outcomes, which I'll go into in a second. But the incidence of this was absolutely unbelievable. So the people they studied, 64%, so almost 2/3 of people had had at least one of these ACEs in their childhood. 16% had had 2, 10% had had 3, and 13% had 4 or more of these adverse experiences. And so this showed us that these ACEs are incredibly common, but also they showed that they were clustered, which means that if someone had at least one adverse event, they were 80% likely to have more than one. So they happen together very often. The other thing that this study showed was a dose-response relationship. And what that means is the more you have of something, the greater the effect it produces. So the more ACEs someone had experienced, the greater the negative outcomes later on in adult life. And so these effects are long lasting. They're not things that just happen in childhood at around the time that the stress is happening. They actually flow on to affect health and well-being through the rest of life. So that was really a fascinating outcome of this study. These childhood experiences are affecting us as adults. So some of the outcomes that they identified, one of the most interesting was the physical impact that these ACEs were actually creating chronic illnesses, a higher risk of many chronic diseases, including COPD, which is things like emphysema or bronchitis or just breathing issues, a higher incidence of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, more skeletal fractures, greater obesity, higher incidence of stroke, more problems with sleep. So these ACEs in childhood were creating physical health issues in adulthood. The impacts were not just psychological, which is absolutely fascinating, but also there were psychological impacts as well. Mental health issues, one of the things that was elevated the most was people attempting to end their own life, dealing with depression, having panic attacks, dealing with anxiety, having hallucinations, and experiencing PTSD, including CPTSD, which is complex PTSD, which results from chronic exposure to stress like these ACEs over an extended period. And the third type of outcome that they observed was an increase in risky behaviours. So things like overuse of alcohol, addiction to drugs, smoking excessively, risky sexual behaviours. So these three outcomes, the chronic illnesses, the mental health issues, and the risky behaviours, were what were observed in elevated levels in these adults who had experienced these ACEs as children. So what are the mechanisms under, like why are these ACEs having this effect on health for such an extended period afterwards? Well, there's a few proposed mechanisms. The first one is biological, that there is actually a change happening as a result of these ACEs in the way that the brain develops, and also in how the stress response systems are being activated. Secondly, there are behavioural changes. So as children exposed to these things, they're learning these coping mechanisms and they're carried on into adulthood. It's what worked then and they just continue doing that. The third is impaired development, so not having the opportunities to develop the necessary social or emotional skills that will allow them to function better as adults because of these adverse experiences in childhood. And the fourth mechanism is chronic stress activation. So as a result of these childhood stresses, the stress response is chronically activated. Cortisol's running around the system constantly, and it just creates wear and tear on the body's systems. It ages us faster, basically, because of this constant state of vigilance or anxiety or elevated stress for whatever reason. Now, it's important to understand that not everyone was affected this way. Keep in mind, even the people who had these ACEs, not everyone had the same degree. It's always about a correlation, but it's not an absolute guarantee. Some people had more resilience, so as children perhaps they had resilience, or as adults they've developed that, but in either case they're not as adversely affected by these experiences later on in life. And some of the things that contribute to that as children is if they had stable adults in their environment, or perhaps their environment was safer and more stable than the average, or perhaps they somehow managed to learn good coping skills. In these situations, having these ACEs didn't lead to as much adverse outcomes on health and well-being as adults. So I'll link you to an ACE quiz that you can go and do to figure out, what you might have been exposed to and how many of these you had as a child. But regardless of what you find, it's really important to understand, okay, well, I have an ACE. Maybe you can recognize some of these already in your experience without having to do any quiz. What do you actually do about this? Well, there's a number of things that you can do. First and most important is self-care. Actually taking care of you and your needs is really important because that's a lot of what was missing in childhood. And so practicing self-care, and I've got a guide with over 100 different self-care techniques and activities you can use to try and find something that works for you that you can introduce to elevate the levels of self-care in your daily experience. You also need to make sure that you have healthy routines, things that actually support your well-being, because when you have ACEs, you're missing that stability and security. Creating that for you now in your day-to-day life can be really powerful as well. And also to learn coping skills. So perhaps in the presence of these ACEs, it was really hard to develop constructive coping skills. So learning those now, replacing the less helpful habits with more constructive habits can be really helpful as well. So that might include things like meditation or learning how to regulate your emotions. And I've got a guide on emotional regulation that I'll link for you as well. And also making sure you've got support. So social support, friends and family, professional support if need be. Having those strong connections with other people can also negate some of these negative impacts of these ACEs that you may have experienced. And of course, there are many therapies that you can explore that can help with dealing with the impact of these ACEs, whether that's conventional things like cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, things like EMDR, looking at alternative approaches, things like EFT, meridian tapping, bioenergetics, or breathwork. And I've got guides that you can download on many of those that I'll link for you as well. But also, this whole channel is about finding ways to deal with the things from our past, to let them go so that they don't affect us, so that we can heal and grow. So explore this channel and find other videos that might help you learn the skills and release some of that stuff from your experience. And if you want to dive deeper into my ABCD framework for dealing with the issues once you've identified them, watch this video next. And I'll see you in the next one.